Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. As you guys know, I'm Professor Long. We're in this COVID shutdown, and I'm converting my face-to-face courses to online. So these videos are done quickly, they're done crudely, they're usually done in one take. Actually, this one's on about take 6 or 7 because I'm dealing with 2 major emergencies that have interrupted me in the middle of these lectures where I've had to start over. It's getting rather frustrating, but I just got a lot going on. But I'm no different. I know y'all got a million things going on too. These videos are intended for those of you taking my anatomy classes at Del Mar College. This video in particular is for my Human Anatomy and Physiology 1 course. I'm hoping this is the last lecture. If not, it'll be the next to the last lecture, and we're done for the semester. As you guys, if you're not in my class, well, then I hope you learned something from it. If anyone has some constructive criticism, please provide it. Sometimes I get thrown off and distracted, so these videos aren't as smooth as I'd like them to be. They're certainly not the quality of production and slickness that I would like to have, but I got kids and dogs and things going on that are interrupting. I'm dealing with some emergencies, so occasionally I get a text and I have to look down at my phone, and I'm trying to keep this rolling. It's distracting. So anyway, if you're in my Part 1 class, we're in the nervous system. We did a whole series of quizzes on how neurons function, how action potentials work, and synaptic activity. You got to know that. You must know action potentials, sodium and potassium, and the release of neurotransmitter and its breakdown and binding to postsynaptic membranes. That is a huge concept in physiology that's going to help y'all in the long term for your health careers and as students in biology. And then once we got past that, we started talking about the brain structures. We went over the basic functions. A very fundamental understanding of which parts of the brain do some basic functions. It's far more complex than I've led you to believe. And then we've gone into the spinal cord. We went over the first series of lectures, the first lecture in this series for lecture test 6, or the series of quizzes that will be lecture test 6, was over the ventricles and cerebral spinal fluid and the meninges. And then we went into the anatomy of the spinal cord, and then we went into the physiology of what's happening inside the spinal cord. Now, we're going to do chapter 15 and 16. These are 2 very big chapters, especially 15, that are very complex. And I want you guys to know something, sort of another disclaimer. I graduated with honors in biology. A lot of my research a lot of my work and my studies were in cell and molecular biology. I also worked in a research lab as an undergraduate and got my name on some abstracts and did some presentations at some national neuroscience meetings and things. And my research was in neuroscience and neuroanatomy and physiology of the hippocampus, where memory and learning occurs. And then my master's, I went on and did a whole bunch of biochemistry in the brain, some protein biochemistry, but in neurobiology. So my master's is in neuro. And then I started the PhD program and went through different neuro labs. I finally wound up in a guy's lab where we did a bunch of neurobiology, really of the eye, but it was all neuro. I have a very strong understanding of the nervous system. I know that there's 3 great frontiers left in research that are largely unexplored. Some people might argue there's a few others, but the deepest space we know very little about. We're just now touching that. The deepest parts of the ocean, we're just getting to that in the past 10 years. And the deepest parts of the nervous system and how it really functions as a whole. We know a lot, but the more questions or the more answers we come up with, the more questions it has. The brain is extremely complex, and there's no way in a single physiology or 2 semesters of physiology and anatomy that I could give you any comprehension of how this works. So we're keeping it very simple and basic and fundamental. Also, as my other disclaimer is, a lot of my students are health science majors. So I could go into all this complex biology and rattle off 100 different PowerPoints of all this stuff, but how much are they really going to learn? So I want my students to have a fundamental understanding of the brain and the spinal cord and what the structure is doing. And we're going to do some integration in chapter 15, and then we're going to reiterate the sympathetic, parasympathetic, the autonomic nervous system in chapter 16, which we really have already done, but we're going to touch on it again and test on it some more, since it's so vital to your career. So now that I've rambled for 5 minutes, chapter 15 is integration. The term integration and to integrate means to take other bits of pieces of things and put them together into a bigger picture. Okay, so neural integration means we're taking all this sensory input, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, vibration, temperature, pain. We're taking all of this information, feeding it into our brain, and our brain has to make decisions to increase our chances to survive as an individual and as a species. Ultimately, all organisms are designed to do two things, or all animals anyway. Survive as an individual. That means look around the world, find food and water and resources for survival, for consuming energy. And avoid predators, avoid becoming food for another organism. So while we're eating and looking for food, we have to be wary of predators. If you watch the TV shows Alone or Naked and Afraid or these survival type shows, and I'm not talking about the TV show Survivor, that gets into social interactions and psychology, but I'm talking about physical survival. When you're in the middle of nowhere, what do you got to do to survive? The second major function is survival as a species. So once we've taken care of food and shelter and that survival, the ability to avoid predators, then we can worry about our DNA existing in the universe long after we die. And that's what survival as a species is about. Find a mate, make as many miniature versions of you that have your genetic information in it, and hopefully when you're dead and gone, your DNA will be surviving for generations and generations and generations. And an incredible amount of our physiology and our sociology, our social behaviors and behavioral psychology and all of this stuff, really goes around those two things. Finding food and avoid becoming food, finding mates and reproducing. We really are machines for genes. And we are driven genetically, biochemically, to continue our survival into the future, even after we're dead and gone. That's why reproduction is such a strong drive and evokes so much emotion and energy. Now, while we're integrating, when we're taking information in, we are really at the most fundamental levels thinking, does this situation increases my chances of survival as an individual or as a species? If the answer is yes, you don't change it. If the answer is no, you better have some kind of change in your interaction in the environment. And so integration is helping us both take in sensory information and make sense of it, but also to make decisions and send motor commands out the spinal cord to our effectors to adjust our ability to survive. So that's all that integration is about. Taking the small pieces of the puzzle, figuring out what's going on, and sending out the proper motor commands. There's a few definitions we have to go over. One of these definitions is a stimulus. Now, we did this at the beginning of Part 1 A&P, but I'm going to repeat it, and I'm going to take another look at it. A stimulus originally is defined as any detectable change in the environment. And that can be the internal or the external environment. So, if a car backfires in Houston, Texas, and I'm sitting down here in Corpus Christi, I'm not going to hear it. It's not a stimulus to me. To some other organisms it might be, but to me, no. The second one is going to, if a thunderstorm is happening, a few miles away and thunder goes off, I'm going to hear that. That's a detectable change. That's a stimulus. Now, in the world of neuroscience, what that can also mean is this, and this is going to lead us to this idea of integration. When we take a sensation into the nervous system and up to our brain, there's usually a series of 3 neurons, and I'm talking about a lot of our somatic sensations for right now. But usually, there's a series of 3 neurons that go from the periphery into our spinal cord, up to our brain, and then to our conscious awareness. Not all of them work this way, but I'm going to do these for my class for now, and then later on you guys can figure out other details as you move on in your education. So let's say I have something like touching my finger. I have a sensory neuron out in the periphery that's going to extend to the spinal cord. And as you guys know, when we study the spinal cord, I'm only going to draw half of the spinal cord here. We have the dorsal root ganglion, our spinal nerve. We have all this information, okay? So we're feeding information into the CNS at the spinal cord, and then we have our gray horns. A sensory neuron is going to come in through the dorsal root and synapse in the posterior gray horn, and the soma is in the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, so now I'm going to erase this in a second, but ultimately the neuron coming in from the periphery into the posterior gray horn is called the first order neuron. because it is the first one in a series of 3. Now that neuron is going to synapse on another neuron here in the posterior gray horn. That's going to send an axon out through one of the white columns up to our brain. So we have a second neuron that's going to go up, and usually, not always, and we're going to learn the exceptions, a couple of minor exceptions in a minute, but usually it's going to go from the spinal cord up to the thalamus, or wherever it goes up to, which part of the brain it goes up to. It's going to be called the second order neuron because it's the second one in the series of 3. Now, the third order neuron usually is going to go from somewhere in the brain, some higher center. For this one, we're going to use the thalamus, and it's going to go to the post-central gyrus. If you remember, we had the pre and the post-central gyrus with the central sulcus. The post-central gyrus is the primary sensory cortex, and some sensation in the body is going to be processed somewhere along the post-central gyrus. That neuron that extends from the thalamus to the post-central gyrus is going to be called the third order neuron. So if you're following in my note set, then we're on page 91. We have the definitions up here. We talk a little bit about integration. We have the definition of a stimulus. We're going to add sensation, and we're going to add a third one that's not there called perception in a moment. But if you get to the bottom part of the page, it tells you all sensory pathways, or many of them, pass over a series of 3 neurons from the periphery to our cerebral cortex. They're called the first order neuron. The first order neuron extends from the periphery to the posterior gray horn. Its synapse, or its soma, lies in the dorsal root ganglion. So you need to know that information. That's what's in bold in my note set. That's what I want you to know. The second order neuron, you need to know where the soma lies. It lies in the posterior gray horn, and it will send its axon through an ascending tract up the spinal cord, usually to some higher center. Right now we're talking about the thalamus. So you need to know that about the second order neuron. The third order neuron starts in some nucleus or center high up in the brain. Right now we're talking from the thalamus, and it will usually extend to the cerebral cortex in some way or form. So you need to know all of that information. It's what's in bold in the note set. It'll be in the worksheet for you to fill in. And what I want you to know is, because our brain is taking in sensory information and making sense of it, all sensory tracts that enter the spinal cord have to go up the spinal cord to higher centers. So anytime you hear the term ascending tract, you should automatically think ascending tract equals sensory tract. All sensations are going to come into the spinal cord. The tracts in the spinal cord will go up the white columns, one of these white columns here, and in these areas we have little bundles of axons, and in 3 dimensions they would be traveling up and down the spinal cord. I'm going to redraw this prettier in a moment. But that's why we call them tracts. They're bundles of axons, and if I have information coming in from a particular region of the spinal cord, they're all going to share the same tract. Now, when we're talking about a stimulus, and we're talking about this setup, all ascending tracts are sensory. Now, what I want to get to is a couple of things. Okay, let me erase this, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. But before I do so, imagine this. If you guys were sitting in a room, and I have someone else in a second room, and I have you staring at a monitor, and that monitor is showing us an action potential for this first order neuron. And it's sitting here at resting membrane potential, minus 70 millivolts. Okay? You can tell me if this person detected a stimulus. If I'm sticking electrodes in here and running it into a box and reading the voltages, like we do in an action potential, and you see this, if the resting membrane potential is never disturbed in that neuron, then you know they haven't received a stimulus. Okay? Now this is for the general senses. The special senses, we'd have to monitor a different cell called a receptor cell. We'll get to that later, part 2. Now, if while you're reading this, you see these little positive like EPSPs or IPSPs, you know something has caused the cell to open sodium or potassium channels. That's a stimulus. If it fires an action potential, then that changes from a stimulus into what we call a sensation. But for now, a stimulus is anything that alters the resting membrane potential of your receptor cell or first order neuron. So anything that alters the resting membrane potential of this first neuron, at least in the general senses, is going to be called a stimulus. Okay. Now, if it does reach threshold and fire an action potential, we know that neuron is going to release a ton of neurotransmitter at this synapse. If someone else is monitoring this neuron and you see changes in its resting membrane potential, or it fires an action potential, that's when we get to what's called a sensation. Now, in one sense, a sensation is any stimulus that is processed by the CNS. Well, if this neuron never reaches threshold, the first order neuron, we're never going to have it reach here. It would be shut down before it gets there. Once this neuron fires an action potential, we will actually turn this into a sensation. Another way to define a sensation is any stimulus strong enough to alter the resting membrane potential of the second order neuron. Any stimulus strong enough to alter the resting membrane potential of the second order neuron. Anything that disturbs that would be called a sensation. Now, not all sensations reach our conscious awareness. Many times this sensation will fire, but somehow, some way, our thalamus has the ability to filter out a lot of sensations, over 99% of them, because we can only pay attention to what's important. For example, while I'm talking to you and waving my hands, you guys are very much unaware that there's a little ledge right here, or there's a metal border around this, or that I'm holding markers in my hand over here, because you're trying to pay attention to what's important, and your brain has to filter out. The seat pressing on your butt, your clothes on your body get all filtered out so that we can pay attention to important information. If the third order neuron fires an action potential and we become consciously aware, then that's the definition of perception. Perception is the conscious awareness of a sensation. If we're not aware of it, it hasn't reached our perception. So perception is the conscious awareness of a sensation, at least for now. So there's 3 definitions you need to know, and on 2 of them you need to know 2 variations. A stimulus is any detectable change in the environment or anything that alters the resting membrane potential of the first order neuron. A sensation is any stimulus that reaches the CNS or anything that alters the resting membrane potential of the second order neuron. Perception is the conscious awareness of a sensation. Now, when it comes to our sensory pathways, all sensory pathways are ascending. We don't have any structures out here that interpret sensory information in an integrative way. And so, in order for information to be processed by my brain, I have to send it up the spinal cord into my brain or in through a cranial nerve higher up. So whenever I talk about, and we said this a second ago, an ascending tract, the word ascending tract should immediately trigger you to think, oh, this is sensory, because the sensations have to go up the spinal cord. And if we do look at the spinal cord in cross-section, here's a bigger version of it. You guys kind of know this anatomy now from the previous lectures. These white columns are actually divided up, and let me redraw this one. This one has 2 little funky bumps in it called fascicles. The one that's closer to the posterior median sulcus here is called the fasciculus gracilis. Okay? And then the one that comes after that, or next to it, I should say, is called the fasciculus cuneatus. All right? So, the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus, these 2 fascicles these 2 structures have a lot of sensory tracts in them. So this next bump next to this is called the fasciculus cuneatus. Okay. On the opposite side of the spinal cord, I'd have the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. They're the outer edges of the posterior white column. When we look at all of these areas of the spinal cord, there are little round structures in here that if we stain them and dyed them, we would see these little round structures in here, and inside of them, these little dots would be axons coming up the spinal cord. And if we looked at the spinal cord in 3 dimensions, then we would have this tract would look like a long, tall column. That's why we call these white areas of the spinal cord white columns. And essentially, each white column has tracts running up and down the spinal cord. And within those tracts are axons that share common origins and destinations. For example, I'm going to erase this right here. I'm going to try to give you an example of what I mean so that all of this will make sense. If I have a bunch of sensations coming in from my finger, they're all going to synapse at a certain level of the spinal cord, and then all these axons coming from here going up are going to be bundled together. And they might be found, let's say, in this particular tract. So I would have a bunch of axons coming up from some level of the spinal cord, going up through a particular tract to my brain. If I have another level of the spinal cord where other sensory information is coming in, it may ascend, and I might find all those axons running through a totally different tract in a different white column, maybe even on the other side of the spinal cord. So we call the white areas white columns because within those white columns there are tracts, bundles of axons with common origins and destinations in our nervous system. What that means is if I compress a certain part of the spinal cord, I may disrupt incoming sensory information or maybe outcoming motor information. Right now we're worried about the sensory tracts. So now, all sensory pathways are going to travel over a series of 3 neurons. First order leads to the spinal cord. Second order from the spinal cord up to the brain. Third order from some area of the brain up to the cortex. All sensory tracts are ascending. And I'm going to skip a page for a moment, and we're going to skip over to page 93. When we look at the name of a tract, the name of the tract will tell you if it's ascending in sensory or descending in motor in most instances. There are some exceptions, and I'll tell you how to make sense of those. But let's make it easy first, and then we throw in a couple of exceptions, and you know it all. You can be able to answer all the questions you need to know and know if it's ascending in sensory or descending in motor. There are usually 2 words that are stuck together before we get to the word tract in the name. The first half of the word tells you where the tract starts in the nervous system. The second half of the word tells you where the tract ends. These tracts are either going to go from somewhere in the spinal cord to the brain or for somewhere up higher down into the spinal cord in most instances. So, all sensory tracts are going to start with, or most of them are going to start somewhere with the word spino. Now there's usually not a hyphen, but I'm going to put one in here. And the second half of the word tells you where it ends. So if I tell you I have a spinothalamic tract, that tells you the tract starts in the spinal cord and ends in the thalamus of the brain. Therefore it must be going up or ascending, therefore it must be sensory. Now, when you look at page 93, the first 2 tracts are called the lateral spinothalamic tract and the anterior spinothalamic tract. So there's 2 spinothalamic tracts. The first word in the name, the anterior or lateral, tells you which white column you will find that tract in. The lateral spinothalamic tract is found in the lateral white column. The anterior spinothalamic tract is in the anterior white column. So the name of the tract gives you a tremendous amount of information. And since it goes from the spinal cord to the thalamus, it must be sensory. Now, it turns out that these 2 tracts carry a lot of sensory information about pain and temperature and very crude touch, a very crude sense of touch. So you should also know that about the spinothalamic tracts. They do pain, temperature, and some very crude touch. Okay. Now, I'm going to skip the next 2. And we're going to do the last 2 ascending or sensory tracts of the spinal cord. There's a posterior spinocerebellar tract and an anterior spinocerebellar tract. So look at the name. Spinocerebellar. Starts in the spinal cord, ends in the cerebellum. So what does the cerebellum do? The cerebellum does motor coordination. So these are going to take proprioceptive information. so that we can become coordinated. If you're trying to learn how to juggle, then they're sending sensory information about your body positioning, and if you keep dropping the ball, then you need to make some kind of motor adjustment. And so they help with motor coordination because they're sending information, proprioception, about our body positioning into the cerebellum. There's one in the posterior great horn called the posterior spinocerebellar tract. The posterior white column. The posterior white column contains the posterior spinocerebellar tract. And the anterior white column has the anterior spinocerebellar tract in it. They do a proprioception, cerebellum coordination. The spinothalamic tracts are doing sensations like touch, temperature, pain, crude touch, I should say. Now, the fasciculus cuneatus and fasciculus gracilis. If you look at the word fascicle, that starts with F. I think the fasciculi are doing feelings. They're doing sensation. The fasciculus cuneatus and the fasciculus gracilis, which are part of the posterior white column, do some sensations like very fine touch. Okay, they're also doing things like some light pressure and some tactile information, and they send that up to our medulla, and then we pass it on there. So all 6 of these tracts, the anterior spinothalamic tract and the lateral spinothalamic tract, are ascending, and they do sensations about crude touch, temperature, and pain. Okay, the posterior spinocerebellar tract and the anterior spinocerebellar tract are sending information about coordination, proprioception for the cerebellum to coordinate. And then the fasciculus cuneatus and the fasciculus gracilis send feelings of fine touch, very fine feelings, the F's. So fine touch, light touch, some very light pressure and vibration in the skin. So you need to know that information. Now, when it comes to the motor tracts, we're going to back up to page 92 for a second, and we're going to talk about the motor tracts. So we have this image of the spinal cord and motor commands coming up. So let me erase this information here. And we're going to talk about descending or motor tracts. I mean, this is one of the simplest things. And, of course, my instructors never explained this to us. They gave us 1,000 PowerPoints and printouts and talked like auctioneers. And then when we went to the library, we figured this out. Oh, look, this is the easy way to think about it. Descending tracts are always going to be motor. So when you hear the term descending tract or motor tract, you think of the other term, descending motor, motor descending. Because up here in our brain, if I'm going to send motor commands down, boy, that's a really long medulla. The thought to initiate them usually starts somewhere higher and then descends, and then I have a motor neuron going out to muscle. We have 2 neurons usually in the pathway. Not always, but this is a simple way to think about it. The top one is called the upper motor neuron because it's higher up in the brain and descends down. And then the second one is usually called the lower motor neuron because it's lower in the spinal cord. Now, these are somatic motor pathways. If we were talking about autonomic motor, then the upper motor neuron would synapse somewhere down here, and then the lower motor neuron would still come out, but it would go to a ganglion, like the sympathetic ganglion, the autonomic ganglion, like we were talking about going to the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic regions. We have the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron. Okay, we did that in the last lecture. But we're going to simplify it, and we're just going to talk about these right now. But the similar information applies, only there's an extra motor neuron in the autonomic pathways, the ganglionic neuron. The upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron are the 2 neurons. The upper motor neuron is somewhere higher up and extends down to the spinal cord. The lower motor neuron extends from the spinal cord out to an effector or a ganglion if we were talking about autonomic, but we're not going to. And that's in your note sets. All motor pathways are going to end with the word spinal, or many of them, not all of them. So if I have a corticospinal tract that begins in the cerebral cortex, which is high as you can go, you can't go any higher. So if it starts in the cortex, it must go down. And this one goes from the cerebral cortex to your spinal cord. must be motor. So if you look at the page 93, here's a lot of descending tracts. I'm going to skip the ones that don't play by this rule first. So we have a lateral corticospinal tract. That means it lives in the lateral white column, and it goes from the cortex to the spinal cord. And we have the anterior corticospinal tract, lateral and anterior corticospinal tracts. And they're going to be sending motor commands down to the gray horns of your spinal cord. Okay, we're not going to worry about, they're all going to be motor commands, so we're just going to learn this part. So if you have corticospinal, starts in the cortex into the spinal cord, must be descending, therefore must be motor. And then the lateral and the anterior part tells you which white column that they're in. The corticobulbar tracts don't always make it down to the spinal cord. But if they start in the cortex, and I asked you, what is the bulbar region of the brain? Hell, I don't know. Well, if you don't know, you still know that it's descending in motor because I can't go any higher than the cortex. So it must start in the cortex and come down to something called the bulbar region. And these actually control a lot of facial muscles, some eye movement, and some of this higher stuff. So they don't necessarily come down into the spinal cord. But nonetheless, corticobulbar tracts are motor. Then we have another one called the vestibulospinal tracts. Well, look at the name. It starts in something called a vestibule. The hell is that? I don't know. I do know, but maybe you don't. And maybe you do, who knows. But the vestibulospinal tract ends in the spinal cord. It must be descending. It must start somewhere higher in the structure called the vestibule. And these actually do a lot of subconscious motor movement about maintaining our balance. So it's sort of a lower part of the brain that we're not consciously thinking about. For example, if your brain says, I need to stand up and walk across the room to get something, then the vestibulospinal tract, your cortical brain may turn it over to those lower areas, and they're going to make minor adjustments so that we're not falling around like we're drunk, walking across the room. We're very well coordinated. So they're kind of subconscious. Okay. And then we have a thing called the tectospinal tract. And once again, what is the tectum of the brain for the tectospinal tract? Well, it doesn't even matter if you don't know what it is. You can still look at it and say if it ends in the spinal cord, it must be coming down. So looking at the name very often tells you what it does. Now, the tectospinal tracts also do a lot of movement of parts of our arms and some of our head and neck. So it's all rather complex, and there's a lot of overlap. But nonetheless, you should be able to look at the tract and tell me if it's motor, if it ends in spinal, or it can only come down from the cortex and go somewhere. It must be descending in motor. Now, there's a couple that don't play by this rule that are motor tracts, but it's easy to think about. I always think about, when you think about the ancient pyramids in Egypt, somebody had to move all those blocks to build them. So anytime you hear about the pyramidal tracts, there are some structures on the medulla called the pyramids. The pyramidal tracts were moving things, so they're motor. And then there's some that are just outside of that called the extrapyramidal tracts, but they play by the same rules. So anything with pyramid in the name is going to be moving. It's going to be moving stuff like you had to move stones to build the pyramids. The fasciculus gracilis and vesiculus cuneatus do fine feelings. The pyramids are movement. So now you know by all the tracts if they're sensory or they're motor, if they're ascending or descending. Got it? All right, so now I'm going to stop there. We got one more video to do, and we're going to reiterate the autonomic nervous system. And we've really already done this, but there's a little bit more detail I might throw at you. It starts on page 94 of the note set. So thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. I hope you had as much fun as I did. I finally got to complete this video. Yay. One more, folks, and we're done with part 1 AMP for this semester, and you can get ready for part 2 if your grades are good enough. If they're not, come back and retry part 1 until you get it down. Anyway, see you guys on the flip side. Hope you had as much fun as I did.